Hi everybody, welcome to today's seminar, which is on forced marriage of people with learning disabilities. Before we start, just a little bit about the Ancraft Trust, which is the organisation that Deborah and I both work for. We're a national charity based at the Centre for Social Work at Nottingham University, and we work with professionals and agencies across a whole variety of organisations, statutory sector, voluntary sector, and the independent sector. And our the main premise of our work is safeguarding vulnerable adults and disabled children and all the issues that go with that. I just want to start by saying this is obviously a very emotive issue and emotive subject, but we wanted to make clear right from the very beginning that the Ancraft Trust and Deborah and I absolutely support the right of people with learning disabilities to marry. But what we're looking at is people having the ability to consent to marriage and the capacity to understand what marriage entails. And forced marriage is obviously very different to actually two people entering freely into a marriage where they both understand what's expected of them and what marriage entails. So to move on, what is forced marriage? Forced marriage is a marriage conducted without valid consent of both parties where duress is a factor. That's the definition that's used by the Forced Marriage Unit. It's an abuse of human rights. It's not a true religious or cultural practice. It's very, very different from arranged marriage. And I think it's important to set out from the beginning that we understand that there is a difference between forced marriage and arranged marriage, which is a long-established tradition based on compatibility and consent, and where both parties enter freely into that marriage. Starting over some facts on forced marriage. The forced marriage unit, I think, opened in 2005, I think, as a response to these issues coming to the forefront and a recognised need to put some kind of framework around working with people that might be forced into marriage. And what the Forced Marriage Unit was saying, in 2007, of 400 cases that were referred to them, so they're only the cases that are known of, approximately 80 of them involved people with a learning disability. So it's a significant number of people being forced into marriage have a learning disability. It's not an insignificant number. Most cases reported to the Forced Marriage Unit involved families from South Asia. And the Metropolitan Police have recently put some figures together of cases that they're aware of. And in 2007-2008, 156 of the 208 cases that they became aware of involved people from Asia. Now these are cases that will have come to light actually because some crime has been committed. So again, the problem is much broader than that, but this is the number that they're aware of. And interestingly, forced marriage isn't an issue that only affects adults, it also affects young people as well. Of the figures that the Metropolitan Police had, 66 cases were reported to them where people were under 18, and there were another 81 cases reported to them where people were between 18 and 25. So this is a very significant issue in relation to schools being aware of the issue, and in relation to special schools as well being aware of. These aren't necessarily figures in relation to people with learning disabilities. These were the figures that they had for all forced marriages that they came across. But I just think that the figures are interesting to show where most of the people originate from and what ages people are. So as we say, the Forced Marriage Unit was set up in 2005, and it's a joint initiative between the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the Home Office, and it offers a range of services to people. It offers information for victims of forced marriage. It offers information for professionals who may encounter forced marriage, and there is statutory guidance setting out the processes that agencies must have in place. So the Forced Marriage Unit actually work with people who themselves have been forced into marriage, and will work with people to help bring them back to this country, and will work now within the, what's the name of the Act, the Forced Marriage, the Act?
Yes.
So I'm right out of my head. Anyway, work within the new legislation, where orders can be granted for people to be, it doesn't end the marriage, but it ends people having to live within that marriage. If I had waited till the next slide and answered my own question. The Forced Marriage Civil Protection Act. It's an act that makes provision for protecting individuals against being forced entering into marriage without their free and full consent, and for protecting individuals who have been forced to enter into marriage without such consent and for connected purposes. And I think the reason why the Ancraft Trust became interested in this issue, it's all around the issue of consent and the ability to consent to marriage and to understand what marriage entails. Okay. So people with learning disabilities can be forced into marriage through a whole range of mediums, through harassment or trickery, through assault, through kidnapping, through blackmail, and through a lack of capacity to consent. I'd like to ask you as an audience now to turn to the person next to you and just consider for the next few minutes why you think people with learning disabilities might be forced into marriage. So just take a few minutes just to talk to the person next to you.
Economic purposes. Possibly to cover up the learning disabilities. Yes. I'm aware that some people, not necessarily mental health, and then they would just try to encourage marriage afterwards and just
Okay, thank you for taking the time to just discuss this. What I meant to say at the start of the presentation was as well, if people have any burning questions at the end of each slide, then please do feel free to ask if it's something that you want clarifying. Where the points you want to discuss. So, what sort of issues did your discussions raise?
Well, we came up with, I think it's the point that we came up when we were discussing this before the presentation, that parents might want protection or help for their child after they're gone or after they are unable to provide that. So it might be out of love for the children that they put into a setting that they're supported.
Absolutely, yes. So out of best interest and about really wanting to be clear about what's going to happen to their now grown child once they're not able to look after the child.
Did other people come up with that thought? So it's actually for a caring role that they would want a spouse to as they're getting older, etc.
One point that we came up with was not as nice as that point, but maybe the possibility that parents, because looking after a person with learning disability causes an enormous amount of stress and strain on the person, both physically, emotionally and mentally, that after a while they just want to shift that responsibility to someone else. Although maybe they feel guilty about doing so, it's just something that they just feel that's a way out for them.
So maybe they're not getting enough support to enable them to continue caring, so they're looking for somebody else to take on that role.
And actually that's a big issue, because I think that a reflection is that some of our services are not accessible enough for those people to use, which we know we sometimes don't do a great job at making the services culturally accessible to everybody. So maybe they're thinking we don't want to go the service route, the social care route, and they go this route instead. Whereas if our services were better equipped to work with them, it would be a little bit different. That's not ungenerous, I think it's realistic.
It is.
It is realistic, it's very stressful when you've got a a very disabled person to look after, and you're moving into older age.
We were thinking long-term financial care for that person.
Yes. Yeah.
Being
So-
shifted onto somebody else, and that person can, support he or she financially
Yeah.
for a longer period.
Because we all want security
So
for our
that's-
children.
So that's another aspect of the caring role. It's the caring role and financial.
Yes.
To be accepted in society.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So if it's part of the cultural norm that people are married, then to ensure that people are accepted within that culture to be married, is that?
And then, maybe there's some pressure to go that route.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that a general point, not a point at all, is that a lot of parents that I've worked with children with learning disabilities want nothing more than their child to be accepted, to be like other children growing up.
Yeah.
And this is one way maybe that they could feel that that's happening.
For the want of a better term, it's like normalising.
Yes.
And then there is in certain cultures whereby even for pregnancy, someone is in delivery. So if this child happens to be a girl, they will marry to social family. Now, it's the dignity of parties to stand by their agreements.
Oh, that's interesting.
However, the bride to be happens to be in any way having difficulties, like learning disabilities. They will still stick to it, and then they are released.
So that's interesting. So you're talking about yes, yeah.
Another point that occurred was whether parents might feel that if their child with such difficulties got married, that child might take on more responsibility and learn to cope better in life. And again,
Yes.
it might be that they have the concern and motivation that you were mentioning, but perhaps thinking, well, it might even turn out good for the child if they get married, they'll take on more responsibility. It's actually good. So,
Yeah.
Anything else?
I mean, they're
They're all very good
valid,
person,
and
actually.
we have the Blue Peter list, who's
Yeah.
already done to show you in a minute.
What would be your
So you
reaction?
didn't-
I'll go back.
What would be your reaction as professionals to such an idea where it is, it's empowered, and you will not the authorities say no, it's unable to decide for herself or for himself. So why should you do this? Why should you do that? And so on, because we see a lot of interventions which are actually not very sensible.
I think the issue of the ability to consent is absolutely crucial in what we're discussing. And if people are able to consent and understand what they're consenting to, that's one thing. If they're not able to do that, then that's an issue of forced marriage.
And then the society will decide for them not to go into it. Whereas, if society supports them to be able to decide.
Can you support somebody though entering into a marriage if they don't have the capacity to consent? Because then whatever happens in that marriage will be without their choice, without their consent, and will ultimately be a sexual assault and so on if we're talking sexual relations.
Well, society will have to accept it that they are disabled, because sometimes people are disabled, they were unable to express decisively what I want. Whereas, even in their inner thoughts, they would like to do it.
I think the thing is about capacity to consent is not just about saying to somebody, do you understand this? They say yes. I mean, it's much more complex than that to actually decide that someone doesn't have capacity. And so even somebody who can't verbally communicate, etc., you wouldn't just assume they haven't got capacity. And you'd be very much doing the work in their best interest, not in a controlling way. But we do work with some people who are significantly disabled, who don't have the capacity to consent, wouldn't understand about any aspect of marriage and what's entailed within a marriage. And it's those people who we surely can't agree that they then I mean, that has to be then forced. But I agree, I think if someone can make the choice, that's what we're advocating.
Yeah.
We would like nothing more than the rights of people with learning disabilities to have relationships, to marry, to do the things that other people have expectations
And to be
do.
supported to do so, to be able to access the support to do so, if they're able to make a consent,
An
decision,
informed
informed decision.
decision. And also people with learning disabilities can, and that's fine with support. They will enter into consensual relationships and so on and so forth. So we're absolutely not here to say no one with a learning disability can enter into a marriage. That isn't an attack at all.
I think some people don't. Some people genuinely believe forcing to get married is a way of treating it.
Yes,
So I
yes.
think they're going to be better with physical and mental.
Yes, yeah, so it's a pure,
Yeah.
yes, yeah. Well, in a list I prepared earlier,
As you do.
those points that are raised in there. So, as I was saying earlier on, very little research has actually been undertaken into the field of forced marriage with people with learning disabilities, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence of people that have worked with individuals that have been forced into marriage. And these are some of the reasons that are cited, most of which you've covered as a group today, which is great. So we've got obtaining financial security, we've got the concern for the future of the adult child. There was some evidence from the forced marriage unit that some people have been forced into marriage to obtain a visa for somebody living outside of the UK. Responding to peer pressure to follow cultural norms, and we were talking about, it's acceptable to be married, it's good to be married. The belief that marriage will cure the learning disability and help the person to lead a normal life, and we raise that issue. That families have got the best interests of the person at heart. But I think interestingly, Mandy Sangira, she's a trustee of an organisation called Boys UK, has done quite a lot of work around forced marriage. And she raises the issue that there might actually be gender differences for forced marriage. And she says that in her work, it seemed that men with learning disabilities were being married as a means to obtain a carer. So they were being forced into a marriage as a way of seeing their care through, through their adult life. That women with learning disabilities were being married so the family could maintain face in the community, is the phrase that she's used. So it's about acceptance within the community. So for men it was obtaining a carer, for women it's about being accepted within their community. Is that a point that makes sense to you? Okay, so that was great. Obviously, all the issues that are out there, issues that you recognise as agreed. What we'd like you to do now, please, is just for the next couple of minutes, again talk to the person next to you and just consider what the consequences of forced marriage might be. And that could be for the individual, for their family, or for the community. And if you can just take a couple of minutes and then we'll come back to the larger group. Issues that were raised in your discussions there about the consequences.
So we thought about marriage, eventually one way or another, a breakup.
Yeah.
So with the divorce scenario, I think if they have a child, for example, the child will be most likely to be disabled.
So there might be all sorts of impacts further down the line.
The child wouldn't necessarily.
Not necessarily, but yeah.
But there is a possibility.
Yeah.
And a possibility that the parents would be able to parent the child.
If the mother has the learning disability and has the capacity, there is a high chance that even if she was able to have a child, then she would not be able to nurture the child. It's interesting, did you say it would inevitably split up marriage? So that, I mean...
My experience of
Yeah.
I saw
I don't think you're right.
few cases.
But what of the little one? All along the road, you might compromise and then consent will come in rejected. And then it's no more a fourth one.
Sorry, I didn't understand that point.
During a conversation, my friend was referring to what if after the forced marriage, the person then feels, the individual who has a disability, who then thinks that, well, this isn't so bad, and then agrees with it, and then what does it continue to be a forced marriage? Because at the point of marriage it was forced, but now it's belatedly consented to.
That's a really, really interesting point, and it's a point that we've debated endlessly amongst ourselves about if a person cannot give capacity, doesn't have capacity to consent to the marriage, but is happy within the marriage and feels themselves that it's a good thing. Is it a good thing or not?
Well, I'm not sure about feels happy with the marriage, but they appear to be content in themselves. Does that make it okay? Actually, I mean, no, because they still have not given capacity to that marriage. And I know people who are people with learning disabilities who live in environments that none of us would choose to live in, and they might appear to be content because they know no other, etc. So I think that's not indicative of a real choice. I think you need to be sure that they would have, feel that it's not a forced marriage. They need to know what the choices were, the alternatives were.
What if the question is, if the person has the capacity, but didn't exercise that capacity at the point of marriage, but then later on feels that they now do consent and they understand? I think that was.
We do. I struggle with this because if someone seems content and it's been I find it difficult to say, well, that shouldn't happen and they should.
So with having had the practice of the marriage, they don't understand what they're consenting to. I know it's a very interesting point.
And I think we're going to have to leave that one. It's one of those issues that we don't know the answer to that. But clearly, I mean, you're talking about someone who didn't give consent to that marriage to start with, so let's keep it that. But you're right, and that often crops up, and I think that's a complicating issue. But it doesn't often occur. Most people who haven't got capacity wouldn't. I think, as you said, the marriage probably wouldn't last anyway, so that you're talking about exceptions, I think.
Any other issues that came out of your discussions?
It could be that their fear of them being killed by getting married to being disappointed society. They may not be happy in a relationship, which is why they might want a divorce. But their family, because of their honour, they will say, no, you can't get a divorce, you be married to this person. And that would cause problems within the family and the individual, because they're not happy, their family's not happy, but they can't do anything about it because they're married.
So they're stuck in a situation where they've been forced into a marriage and they're not able to get out of it because their families wouldn't agree to it and they wouldn't know how to.
But they suffer the consequences.
Right. And the limitations of being within that sort of
So it
relationship.
criticises their fear of them being killed with marriage.
Yes.
That side.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And obviously all these points could ultimately be consequent for them to be resentful towards everyone around them.
Yeah.
We were thinking the ultimate consequence is having children and then, the follow-up care and, the complications that come with that. And then obviously that person being in that situation, resenting everybody around them for starting it in the first place.
But then at the same time needing parents to continue to support them if they do have children. Which is a bit of a paradox where parents marry the child off so that they can go away and either shift responsibility or become more normalised. But then not being able to do that and cope on their own, having the families to intervene with them, which
There is the bit in between, of course, between marriage and children, which is the sexual relationship that's necessary in order to procreate. And actually, if someone lacks capacity, then that would be sexual assault because they would not be consenting to that sexual relationship. And that's, so you're talking again what can happen within marriage, which is why sometimes the police might have a statistic because there's been sexual assault within marriage. And I mean that can happen within marriage, but in this case it's because the person actually lacks capacity and wouldn't understand what's happening. So you've got a non-consenting sexual relationship.
Are there any other issues that you came up with?
Just to follow on from the issue of children, we discussed that where there is a child born into a family and the mother or the parents are unable to care for that child, it would then mean that maybe the state would have to intervene,
Yes.
and then that child would then sort of maybe have to be brought up in care or rather than within a family environment. So therefore affecting the psychology of the child that's been born from that relationship.
And that's very real.
Yes, it is. I mean, there's lots of statistics to show that when people with learning disabilities have children, there's much higher incidence of those children coming into the care of the local authority, being looked after by the local authority.
And then obviously the possibility of that person's condition getting worse as well, maybe.
Yes, yes. Although there are fluctuating conditions that.
Well, in the great tradition of, here's another list I prepared earlier, I think a lot of these are issues that have already been raised. We talked about sexual assault or rape, where people can't give their consent to sexual relations within the relationship. And this obviously can cause difficulties if a person has been married, a person without a learning disability has been married to a person with a learning disability without their knowledge. The person without the learning disability is entering into marriage with a range of expectations that the person with the learning disability won't understand. It could also result in domestic violence and abuse, where the person without the learning disability might have very little understanding of learning disability and of what it means to care for a person and what their needs are. And so feelings of resentment might lead to some kind of violence within the relationship. Sorry, there's quite a lot of writing on this side. We talked earlier about the issue of a double forced marriage, where neither party understands the needs of the other party. So the person without the learning disability may be entered into a marriage with somebody who they did not know would have a learning disability until the actual point where they're married. So they themselves have been, sort of put into a forced marriage position because they're unaware of what the person's needs are. And so the spouse might also be vulnerable to abuse from the person, or the family of the person with learning disabilities, if they then decide that they don't want to look after the person with the learning disability. It's issues sort of the broader family, which then may lead to the final point, which is abandonment, where the person without the learning disability leaves the marriage because they're not willing to continue with the marriage. They didn't know they were going to be married to someone with a learning disability, and they don't want to have that responsibility or take on that person's needs. Okay, is that those points all? Yeah. So we'll move on. The next couple of slides are just examples that have been brought to us by the forced marriage unit and by other people that have worked with people that have been forced into marriage. This is a case that ended up in court where a young man with autism and severe learning disabilities was married over the phone to a woman living in Bangladesh. She didn't have learning disabilities, and the Court of Appeal ruled the marriage wasn't entitled to recognition in UK law. And the judge said that consummating the marriage would be tantamount to rape or indecent assault. So it's a recognition by the courts that the person didn't have capacity to be married, and that marrying somebody over the phone can't be recognised as a...
That would be the rape of the man.
It was, yes, it
It would be the rape of
was.
the man.
Yeah,
Yes.
yes.
Because he's the one that has...
Yes, because he...
Well, it would actually be indecent assault.
Yeah.
Because women aren't raped, as far as the law
What
goes.
is that still the case?
Yeah,
Yeah.
only men.
But he, although physically he could...
It's open to
That's
debate,
such,
not
well, let's not go in
legislation.
that, but it's such a...
Yeah.
Because based on what you're saying, capacity, if you don't have the capacity to consent, then it shouldn't matter, whether... I mean, okay, let's leave it at
I think
that.
I might be being done here, I'm not sure.
But I do think that's
I'm trying to continue, but anyway,
It's a criminal offence.
It would have been a criminal offence to consummate the marriage.
because the person didn't have capacity. So if someone hasn't got capacity, any sexual relationship that they have is going to be a criminal offence because somebody is having sex with them without consent. And whether that's a man or a woman, but the only difference would be the crime.
Yeah.
If it's a man that does that without a woman, with a woman without consent, then it's rape. If it's the other way around, it's sexual assault.
Just like It's still
but
it's still a crime.
Yeah,
It's just a different
it's a
act
different
and a different
crime.
form of politics.
Yeah.
I mean, you're very sure it is crime.
It would be a crime, yes.
It would be.
It would be a crime if a sexual act had taken place. It would be a crime.
If one or other partner doesn't consent,
It's a crime. The next case example is that this is just a study that was done in Tower Hamlets of people with learning disabilities, and the study involved people who were either pregnant, married, or were parents. And the study found that all Bangladeshi women identified were married, this is people with learning disabilities, and less than half of the other women with learning disabilities in the study were married. So this leads to the point that somebody had made earlier about the pressure within society, within some societies, for people to be married. So what they were saying was it was a higher than expected number of women from Bangladesh were married. And they question whether the women had all given their consent to the marriage. And the final case study, this was a case that comes from the forced marriage unit, and it was a woman who had severe learning disabilities who confided in somebody who had been a teacher previously. She'd been told she was going on holiday, she was then forced into marriage, raped, and came back pregnant. She was asked to sign forms that she didn't understand, which were for her husband's visa. And the forced marriage unit discovered that she'd been married to 4 other men, so they refused the latest husband's visa, removed her from the family and placed her in a refuge as a place of safety for herself. So I think these case examples show that there are a range of different issues that come into play in relation to forced marriage. Okay, so what is needed? This is the point in the seminar where we start looking at what support is needed for families and what support is needed for professionals. But as I said at the beginning of the seminar, there's not a lot of research or work actually being done in relation to people with learning disabilities and forced marriage. So we don't have all the answers. We're very happy with people within the audience to talk to us about what some of the issues they think are needed. So some of the points that we came up with were that there has to be an acceptance that forced marriage of people with learning disabilities occur. Deborah and I work within the field of safeguarding, the broad field of safeguarding vulnerable adults and children, where we constantly come up against the view that people with learning disabilities, children with learning disabilities can't be abused, they're not abused, there's a whole range of other issues given for some behaviours so
excuses are made.
Excuses, yes. We deal with it all the time. So I think within forced marriage there has to be a recognition that it happens to people with learning disabilities as well. We need professionals who understand what the issues are and have the skills and the knowledge to address them. And some of the work that we're going to talk about in a minute that we'll be doing with the forced marriage unit will hopefully lead to practice guidance that will help professionals have those skills and knowledge. There needs to be a difference between arranged and forced marriages need to be recognised. I think some professionals have a fear of offending individuals and offending communities and have sort of a blindness to some of the issues because of a fear of being culturally inappropriate or culturally insensitive. There needs to be a greater understanding in schools, including special schools. There are a wide number of young girls, particularly, who go missing from schools each year, some of whom may be being forced into marriage, so there needs to be a greater awareness within schools. There need to be, Deborah touched on this earlier on, culturally appropriate services. If services were in place for families that they felt were appropriate and acceptable to them, they may not then be in a position where they feel they have to marry their child to another person to obtain care or financial security in the long term. And again, I quite like this point that was made by Ranjit Sandhya, who I mentioned earlier on. And what she was saying is be clear about protection, not political correction. And I think that's quite a good saying, because I think it's about remembering this is a protection and a civil rights, human rights issue. It's not about being politically correct. Okay. So just very briefly, to talk a little bit about the project that we're involved in, and then we'd be happy to take suggestions from you and questions as well. We've been working with the Forced Marriage Unit alongside 3 other organisations, Voice UK, Respond and Judith Trust. And the Forced Marriage Unit have agreed to fund a project that we've put together to try and get to grips really with what some of the issues are in relation to forced marriage of people with learning disabilities. So the project's going to fund a specialist worker to work within the local authority and the FMU to get a better understanding of what some of the issues are. And that person will be somebody who is, what's the best term? Somebody who is a specialist in the area of learning disabilities, but is also able to access the communities who need to be accessed. The worker will then go on to develop a national picture, and we'll do a national consultation, and that will be with professionals, voluntary organisations, and actually people with learning disabilities themselves who've been forced into marriage. So as well as getting a sort of like a picture of what's happening in London, there's a much broader national picture as well. And then leading on from that, the worker will draft some practice guidance alongside the FMU, and will design a training package that will be used across the country with professionals, and the practice guidance and outcomes will be launched at a national conference. So this is an 18 months project, which will be starting, I think, in March.
Yeah, next month.
So that's the work that we're going to be involved in, to sort of to bring together some of these issues and to help support professionals to work within these issues and to better address them. Very happy to take questions and also to take points that you think would be good for us to consider within the project.
You provided a few statistics. Do you have any chance to compare them with some of the concepts you better than
I think people at the back probably can't. Would that be right?
The question was whether we were able to compare statistics from the UK with statistics from Europe. The answer to that is I don't know. we haven't done it, and
I think that's possible. That's very helpful actually, because what we were going to say was also, have you got any views on what we should be building into the work we're doing on the project? And that's maybe we're talking about a national picture. It might be very useful actually to get some idea of the international picture as well. How easy that will be, I don't know, because every country has obviously different setups with holding statistics. But that would be useful. The trouble is, in a way, we don't have accurate statistics either, because whatever statistics you gather are just the ones that have come to light, if you like. And where there hasn't been a criminal offence, for instance, where the Met have been involved, you probably wouldn't know about the marriage. Because as we've said, there's lots of, like special schools are, sometimes lose the girls at 15, 16 and aren't even picking that up and reporting it. And, so there's lots of, I think, the statistics we have are tip of the iceberg.
Yes, there's lots of underreported.
So that is always the problem, even when you compare statistics. But I guess that would be the same issue abroad, that would be tip of the iceberg. So it would be an interesting exercise. So the answer is we don't know. Thank you for raising it. And we'll come back in a year or so and see if we found anything else.
So you mentioned that part of the project will also help the workers to become more culturally aware of different communities. How do you plan to implement that? Will you be getting feedback from different communities?
Yes. That will be part of the consultation process. The worker that's funded, it will be their job to get the views of all the people that need to give their views in order to inform the practice guidance and the training that will follow on from that.
It would be very arrogant for us to make assumptions about communities that we're not part of, and that's where the project worker will be accessing the appropriate culture as well. People.
When you say the worker will have access to these communities, will the worker be someone from the community?
Yes,
absolutely.
Yes, that's. I mean, we recognise as two white British women standing here talking about this subject that we can raise the issues, but we can't do the work. We wouldn't assume ourselves.
And we're learning disability specialists. And that's why we're involved in this particular subject. There's no way that we would take on being project workers on our project, because we have to have people from the cultures themselves who understand that culture.
Yes, so
I was just going to say, in terms of suggestions, one idea that does come to mind is it appears, and I don't want to generalise, but perhaps it's the first generation community who come here with best intentions and doing quite well for themselves, but perhaps feeling that they need to continue inverted commas, a village culture, perhaps here can perhaps exert some pressure on the children, especially those with special needs. And often I think that parents do this saying it's culture, but also feeling that religion supports that cultural practice. I think it's one of the slides. It's very clear that religion doesn't, whatever religion that might be. I haven't come across religion that supports that. And I would have thought that perhaps one way of doing this would be to have the clergy at the places of worship of these places really come out firmly and bring out the scriptural justification. For example, in Islam, absolutely consent is paramount.
Yes.
You cannot have marriage without consent. And there's so much scriptural justification to put that forward. And perhaps to educate the congregation, whether it be and perhaps educate the clergy, because often you said the schools where people drop out and parents and teachers are noticing. Often the clergy conduct a religious marriage, and perhaps they should go through some training so they can,
Yes. Clergy will be absolutely key to helping sort of inform where we go forward with this as well, really, the views of the clergy, but also I think there was some anecdotal evidence to suggest that there was, I can't remember where it came from, where people might speak openly against forced marriage, but then privately might actually be performing marriages which they know are forced marriage. So it's about trying to get to grips with some of those issues.
But raise the fact that in all of these religions, whatever the culture might be, there's a very clear line that says this is not acceptable, and those that do engage in this are in fact engaging in flat, so that the parents that no longer have the justification of religion. This is simply outdated, outdated culture.
A step more from that is we also think, and it's guesswork at the moment, the project hasn't started, but we feel that parents who have learning disabled children who won't be able to consent to marriage also need some help and support to deal with that, because if it's so much a part of the culture that your children will get married and will have children, etc., and then they have to face the fact that they have a child perhaps who can't do that because it's not acceptable on any level, they'll need support with that themselves. And we are not saying that we don't care about the parents, we only care about the person being accused of forced marriage. We're very concerned that parents feel supported in making decisions not to go through with those marriages and so on. So I think there's parents need to look at as well. And part of the project, we thought the project worker could work with parents to look at those issues and the sort of issues that the parents are having to face when they're recognising that their child perhaps is not being able to freely consent to marriage.
I just wondered whether you looked at the issues of parents doing things without the informed consent of children, and the issues of parents doing good things in their view which are bad things, in relation to other communities, in relation to parents generally, specifically white parents.
And not necessarily marriage.
Yeah.
Just any decisions.
Yeah, but I mean just that whole issue of informed consent of people with learning difficulties. Because otherwise what it seems to be doing is focusing on one sort of oppression.
I think broadly speaking that's the work that we do, that's the work that our jobs are, but obviously today we're here just to present on this.
But could you just talk a bit about what that wider context is?
Well, I think, and it's difficult to talk about that without thinking about the Mental Capacity Act, which now obviously talks about best interests, and the fact that parents, as well as other interested parties, will be, if someone hasn't got capacity to consent, then if the decision's to be made for that person, then you ensure that there are a number of people contributing to the best interests discussion, and I think that would be the case with a subject like this as well. But clearly, most decisions, for instance, where a person lives, who they live with, those sorts of things, don't actually involve criminal offences in the way that this does, if you like. But certainly, a lot of the time, when people can't give informed consent, other people make decisions for them in their best interests. And if necessary, you can bring in, I'm sure you're aware of this, an independent mental capacity advocate now, who will actually work on behalf of the individual who lacks capacity to ensure that their best interests are met. And I think if you're involved in a situation like this, they'll clearly be saying, that marriage can't go ahead because the person can't do something. But yeah, I mean, decisions are made on behalf of other people. The informed consent is interesting because I work with a lot of people who probably wouldn't be deemed to lack capacity, but they probably can't give informed consent because we haven't given them enough information and knowledge. We've just made decisions for them through their lives. So I think one of the things we need to sit up about is a lot of people might be able to enter into, say, an arranged marriage if we gave them enough information. So not to assume they lack capacity, but to try and give them that information to make that choice.
Any other questions?
Any feelings about the work, just the subject generally, that is it a concern, is it something that you feel we're too concerned about, or anything you could contribute to the project?
Sorry, I did forget to say my contact details are there,
yes.
so if anything occurs to you after the seminar, then please do feel free to get in touch. Sorry,
No, that's right, because we would, following this, not necessarily now, but if you have thoughts, or you have thoughts about what we ought to be looking at within the project, we would really welcome them. Or if you want to take part in some way and be involved, if you feel you've got a contribution to make, we're obviously just building up links now. And as we said before, we want to make sure we get the right people doing the project, and certainly we ourselves.
I just want to talk about something else slightly sort of similar to what you're talking about. People with hidden problems, hidden health problems. I know a case where the man had epilepsy, and he knew that he was epileptic, but he was encouraged by his parents to get married. He fell in love with a girl, and nobody told anything to the girl that the man was epileptic. And she was very happy, they got married, but after the man was 30 years of age, his problems got worse, and obviously they had a divorce, but the girl went through a really, really bad stage, and she was threatened, and some really bad experiences she had. So I think parents should be made aware of learning disabilities, and also these problems like epilepsy, people with severe epileptic problems should be really taken care of by, I don't know, society, parents or doctors, whatever, but I think that's a big issue too, because in so many cases
into a situation where you understand what the issues are. I mean, maybe if she hadn't known what the issues were, she may still have entered into the marriage, but it's about not
knowing at all, because parents encouraged the boy thinking that his situation would improve after he got married. Maybe just, marriage would be a cure.
Yes.
They didn't know much about epilepsy, what epilepsy was really, what really meant. So that's something similar to what
I think that's not uncommon. Everyone knows about each other when they know. But if they foresaw that it was going to be a problem, and by marrying them, take care of somebody after that, it's a dishonest arrangement.
Yeah.